I'd like to talk about the really about the ideas of the app. And this is a technology. This is a technology. This conference is about technology, so I've decided to look at two features of the recent media interest and culture within California innovators, and dealing precisely with the app culture, and the idea of artificial intelligence, which is underlying much of it. Speaking of which, this talk is essentially meant as I see both of these form this technology as ideology, and this talk is intended as an ideology critique from a labor point of view. The idea that there are these, and Mehmet Baran went into this quite a bit about the genius creator and his thoughts that are, generative of enormously beneficial products and effects that others are just eagerly waiting for, and then that these innovations create something new which disrupts existing economic entrenched interests. This is the language used: monopolistic, old, entrenched. These innovators free humanity from ossified, entrenched monopoly, corporate, and government interests. Innovators create and disrupt existing conditions and bring about progress. In the case of the app, it gives power to the individual consumer through his or her smartphone. As far as this goes into taxi services, the app is considered a new and superior dispatch which overthrows the embedded dispatch services and the various local taxi companies. The peer-to-peer concept is that it bypasses the company's monopoly over the rides by putting consumers in direct touch with one another. So this is an anti-mediation ideology, that is to eliminate all mediating forces. In addition to the app, the development of driverless cars, which is based on the assumption of the possibility of artificial intelligence, will free the consumer and the app owners from any need for a driver and supposed human error. In fact, the app is not something which acts upon its own through its own genius. The app summons 50,000 people coming from every city in in California into the single most lucrative market, perhaps in the country. And that is what provides the service, the immediate rapid service. The app is a fig leaf, thereby, a legal fig leaf, which allows, has allowed the regulatory agencies, the California Public Utilities Commission, to qualify it as a new type of basically livery service, which they do regulate in this state. These ideas are variants of theories already expressed in the earliest 20th century. They're forms of technological determinism, essentially that ideas producing a new product, the product changes society, and society is ultimately better in the long run. Yes, some people are displaced, but eventually they get jobs in other places or in the new system. Technological determinism was first expressed by Thorstein Veblen in the 1920s. The concept of disruptive power of innovation was discussed by Joseph Schumpeter in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy in 1942. His term was creative destruction. This idea was also used by David Stockman in the Reagan presidency. But history and society are more complex than a one-way creation-response relationship. In general, technological advances are answers to particular problems of business need to control labor. If labor makes advances in power, tech is introduced to reduce the necessary labor time and skill, thereby putting labor again on the defensive. This is Marx's theory. This phenomenon has been noticed since 1811, when the Luddites first smashed textile technology because it lowered the level of skill required. The utilization of the app was the answer to the desire or the need for Republican deregulators to break the regulatory monopoly of municipalities, taxi companies, and taxi drivers, and gain access to lucrative transportation markets such as San Francisco and New York. The app was the crucial element in the CPUC's decision to allow private individuals to use their cars for hire under the rubric of TNC. This fig leaf was the rationale by which, using massive amounts of venture capital investment money, the TNCs have been able to work their will in state capitals and municipalities, thereby preempting local citizen control over their city's streets. Another purpose of the app is to undermine the skill level of the driver. The drivers of TNCs must use GPS to execute the ride rather than having the knowledge of the city in their head. This often leads to dangerous results. This undermines the professional driver's scarcity and ability to demand higher wages, just as the mill owners of 1811 sought to undermine the control over the craft of weaving by the weavers. That's it. And I have a list of suggested readings. One of the famous books on artificial intelligence is by a guy that was just recently died at Berkeley, What Computers Can't Do. And then he updated that in 2 editions in 79 and 1992 called What Computers Still Can't Do. Dreyfus's book, Dreyfus's thinking, is based on the thinking of Martin Heidegger, and especially an essay called The Question Concerning Technology. As far as the textile mill breakers, the Luddites, the Eric Hobsbawm is one of the famous historians of English history, and this article is from Past and Present from 1952. And anyway, there are other articles in here, including the Schumpeter work. I wasn't able to find a source for the Veblen quote, but he's been generally cited on the internet as introducing that phrase, technological determinism. So,
I'm a San Francisco taxi driver. I have been a taxi driver on and off for the last, well, I first drove in 2002. And during that time, I've only spent 5 years behind the wheel of a cab. I spent 5 years as a lead video engineer. I spent some time back at school where I did a lot of community organizing with a focus on use of technology for communications with activist groups. I did that. My bachelor's degree is in geography with a focus on natural resources management and techniques of geographic analysis. And I'm now currently, in addition to being a taxi driver, I am an analyst for Yellow Cab of San Francisco. And I am trying to use my spatial analysis background to better use data to make taxi cabs more reliable and to figure out how drivers can make more money. During this time, it's as important as possible for taxi drivers to find every source of income that they can, because they're really suffering because it's hard out there. So I want to talk, I have a few things that I want to talk about here. I've got a bunch of notes. I apologize if I'm not a bit more coherent with all my scattered notes here. But so I want to start out by pointing out that technology has the power to do good or bad, and we desperately need it to do good. There are so many problems that the world, that we are experiencing now. Global warming is melting the polar ice caps, while we see Hummers driving around the streets of San Francisco as taxi cabs now. And the middle class is shrinking, the working class is suffering. There are all sorts of things that technology could have been used for to improve the taxi situation in San Francisco, and unfortunately, with the rise of everybody having a GPS on their phone, it has gone the wrong way. It has gone to deregulation and leading to the effective privatization of the taxi industry, and that's not what we need right now. When I got out of school in 2012 and started driving a cab again, I wanted to use my GIS education to solve the taxi problem, and I was beginning to study myself as a taxi driver, recording myself going all over town and trying to figure out how I could, balance the need for a customer to get a cab out by the zoo with a driver's ability to make a living wage, and that has always been the struggle with the taxi industry, is how do you balance those two things? Because if you have too many cabs on the street, the drivers can't make a living wage. If you have too few, then customers can't get a cab, and so that's always the thing. And the situation that we had in San Francisco prior to the start of Uber was the city's best job to balance those things, listening to all sides, coming to the table, and through a public, regulated process, coming up with the number that they thought they would make it so drivers could make a living wage, people could get a cab when they called one, and then looking back at the reasons why taxi regulations first came into play shortly after the Great Depression, the city noticing that too many of them was a bad thing because it would cause absolute chaos on the street. When the taxi regulations first came into effect, there were too many people. Everyone was bringing their own whatever out to be a taxi cab driver. And so they started limiting the numbers. And so now what we have is there are supposedly about 52,000 registered Uber drivers in San Francisco, and we have about 1,800 taxi cabs on the street.
Less now.
Less now because of the 1,800 available medallions to be put out on the street. We can't fill them. Okay, the city can't fill them and get cabs out there because it is so. Drivers are not making living wages. It's out of control. When this was all starting, the current mess that we're in, the city, the MTA, having recently acquired regulatory power over the taxi industry from the police department, had commissioned a study to figure out how many cabs they should actually have on the street. And the number that they came up with, I think, was about 2,500. Basically, they thought that they should increase the number of cabs on the street by about 50%. Unfortunately, by the time the study was actually completed, Uber was really beginning to get its grip and start going, and the people, as they were finishing the study, acknowledged that their study was essentially worthless at this point because it had been completely thrown off by the TNCs. But what we got out of that was that they said there should be 2,500 taxis on the street. We now have 52,000 registered Uber drivers in the city. That is 20 times the amount that a proper scientific study concluded would provide a balance that at least the MTA, thought would work. This is what we need to get back to. We need to get back to something like this, and it's for all these things that we're talking about. The shrinking middle class, economic justice, too many non-hybrid, inefficient vehicles driving around spewing pollutants into the air, when global warming is out of control. Taxis in San Francisco are mandated that they have to be alternative fuel vehicles. So that's one thought. Okay, that's one thought that I have here. One of the biggest things that people, I think, don't understand is the San Francisco taxi industry in general, how it works, what we're losing. I guess I explained a little bit about the taxi industry just now in terms of why the numbers of cabs are regulated. When we talk about transit is better when it is regulated on a local level. You cannot have a large state entity deciding how transportation should work within a small local community. It's not something that can be applied that broadly. And regulators have pretty much always recognized this, which is why taxis are locally controlled throughout the country, most commonly at the city or the county level. And so what's good for one area isn't necessarily good for another. And on top of that, there is I mean, in terms of economics and economic justice, do we want to have global transnational corporations running our transportation networks, or do we want to, have local control over it? Do we want to support local small business, or do we want to support these big companies? Which is ultimately better for workers? Which is more economically efficient for supporting working people? A big global corporation is going to suck money out of the city and into tax havens, even out of the country, and some of these big entities don't even pay taxes. In San Francisco is one of the most Marxist industries in the United States in terms of its taxi industry. In San Francisco, you've heard a lot of people talking about medallions over the last few years, and those medallions, they're really good or they're really bad or whatever's wrong with them. The medallion industry is fascinating in San Francisco because since 1978, it has been mandated that you cannot sell a San Francisco taxi medallion. From 1978 up until about 5 years ago, they changed that because the city had decided they wanted to cash in. But from 1978 until about 2007, medallions were not bought or sold. They were earned by working taxi drivers, and they were given to drivers on the basis of seniority. And once a driver had become senior enough that they could obtain a medallion, it was like some people compare it to like getting your pension finally, or it was basically like you get to, it was a nice bump in your pay, something to work forward to, something to keep you in the industry, and that was something that on one level provided an economic benefit to long-term workers, but it also kept workers in the industry. It gave people buy-in. It made them want to stay there. And one of the things that makes a taxi driver good is that they stick with the job for a while. You become a better driver. There's a study that was done in New York about 10 years ago which showed that taxi drivers had a lower accident rate than any other drivers on the street, or than most drivers. So that's there are all sorts of reasons why the taxi industry in San Francisco has been set up with it the way it is. And it's actually pretty good, and it's a shame that we're losing this right now. And so when we talk about how what we need to do to right the situation, because everybody agrees that we're in a bad spot right now. We need to recognize what we're losing, and we need to recognize that it's different from place to place across the country. What we're losing in San Francisco, I think, is far greater because there was a great deal of progressiveness within the city, or within our taxi industry. And I don't want to make people think that it was like a workers' paradise here also. There was a horrible class divide within the SF taxi industry too, where the people with medallions were doing a lot better than the people who did not have one. So there were struggles within the taxi industry that workers needed to still take care of. But what we had, at its core, it had a tremendous amount of potential. And we're losing that right now. And I think that people need to understand why we need to protect that, why our fellow unregulated taxi drivers over here need to come within the brotherhood of taxi drivers here, and why in other places it's maybe a bit more okay. In New York, the Uber drivers and the taxi drivers there have kind of worked things out a little bit more, where the Uber drivers there actually are being regulated in a matter similar to taxis, and in New York, they're getting along, and maybe in some other areas they could also get along too. You get out into like more rural areas, out of the big cities, I can see a lot of potential, for this kind of style of transportation. But in the big cities here, it doesn't work, because we come back to this problem where, while the city, a study has said that we should have 2,500 taxis on the street, and now we have many more than that. How many we actually have, we don't know, because Uber doesn't want to give up its numbers. But that's a little bit about the taxi industry. In terms of the Uber problem, I want to point out why, at least up until this point, Uber drivers and taxi drivers have not really been getting along that well. We have not been working together to come towards a solution.
Don't leave out Lyft.
And Lyft drivers too. And it's to me, it's not more about Uber and Lyft drivers versus taxi drivers. It's about regulated versus unregulated taxi drivers. And I think that we really need to make that distinction more and more. Uber and Lyft drivers are unregulated taxi drivers. They are performing the same service that the taxi drivers are. They're not doing anything innovative. It's not like taxis did not have apps before Uber. We both kind of came up with them at the same time. The problem was that taxis were and still are playing by the rules set by the city, and our unregulated competition is not. Instead, they're saying that they don't have to play by these rules, and they're doing something different, and they're not going to. And so what made Uber and Lyft so incredibly popular was that while the supply of taxis on the street was limited, when they came on the scene, at some point, when Lyft was the one that really did it. Lyft started saying, well, anybody can bring their own car and start being a taxi driver. They did that for a year while Uber kind of sat back and said, no, we're not going to do that. That's illegal. And when they saw that nobody was stopping Lyft, then they started doing it too. And that's when we had this explosion of tens of thousands of people driving around the city playing taxi driver. At that point, of course, it was easy to get a cab because there were so many of them. If there were that many taxis on the street, it would be just as easy for you to get a taxi cab as an Uber. So there are lots of, I think, misconceptions here that people don't understand. The playing field is definitely not level, which is part of why taxis are being so far left behind. But it's not level because they're not playing by the rules. The rules that they're not playing by give them an economic advantage. They do not have to pay for commercial insurance. They can put as many vehicles out on the street as they want. Their expenses are less, largely because of the insurance, but and even where their expenses aren't less, the thing is taxis operate in the real world where the taxi companies have to pay the bills, the drivers have to pay the bills. We have to work on a realistic budget. The Uber and Lyft are operating on billions of dollars of venture capital and are operating on an unsustainable business model. So what's actually going on right now is a fantasy for anybody who thinks that this can continue. And so if we go, what's really going on is they are trying to pump these billions of dollars of venture capital into this industry so that they can push the taxi companies out and remove local working class control over the industry and bring it to the 1%. And so that's really where we're headed with this. And like Steve was mentioning earlier, this is about the privatization of an industry, of public transportation. Taxis are very largely a public-private partnership, which is the way I look at it, at least. We are public transit, as far as I'm concerned, but we are very heavily regulated by the city. I kind of look at it as the same way that the airport is a public-private partnership. I don't entirely understand it. It is a public-private partnership. It is controlled by the city, but there's something private going on there.
The airlines are private.
The airlines are private. The taxi companies are private, but So something that we need to understand when understanding where we are with the taxi industry moving forward, what the solution is how taxi drivers view what's going on. Taxi drivers, because of their regulations, have to pick up within a certain area. For San Francisco cab, that means we have to pick up in San Francisco. We're not allowed to pick up in Oakland. The Oakland cab drivers have the same restrictions. And so when you pick up outside of your area, you're kind of stealing from the drivers in the other area. As a San Francisco driver, if I were picking up in Oakland, I would be stealing fares from the Oakland cab drivers. They wouldn't like that. I would be undermining their workers' rights, because as independent contractors, we're not recognized under the National Labor Relations Act. We can't form trade unions, as federally recognized, even though the San Francisco Taxi Workers Alliance is now recognized by the AFL-CIO, who is beginning to realize that, I suppose, that the current definitions of labor, need some work, at least in terms of looking at where taxi drivers fit in. When a taxi driver picks up someplace where they're not supposed to be, they're operating as a gypsy cab. And a gypsy cab to a taxi driver is in terms of labor, is basically a scab. And so I don't mean to say this to be disrespectful to people that are driving unregulated taxi cabs, but to point out that in terms of looking for a solution here, we have a problem when we begin talking about fighting for the rights of drivers who are actively, or workers who are actively undermining the rights of other workers. It's a problem, and so it's a problem because it's a problem, okay? It's a problem on a lot of levels. Okay, and I'm told that I have to wrap it up because I know that I'm going for a while here, which is okay. So we need to realize that there are several things going on here. This is a big problem. Any problem that helps one group of workers and not another is not getting to the base problems of helping society move forward. We need economic justice for everybody, but we also can't be pitting worker against worker. We need to stand together and work together in solidarity, and that means that you need to be a taxi driver. And I guess that's good for now. Okay, thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Edward Escobar. I'm the founder of the Alliance for Independent Workers. And yes, I am a driver. I've been a driver for 3.5 years, and that's good. Here, we'll just raise it up. I've been a driver for 3.5 years. I've driven with 9 different apps, which is quite unusual. The retention rate of drivers has dropped to about 2-3 months now, because as was mentioned prior, the industry is being subsidized. So, it's a false cheap ride, if you will. But it's also not just being subsidized by Uber and Lyft, but also by the drivers. It's on the driver's back. And that's why Uber had been negating the allowance of a tipping option for the longest time, even though that is a customary tradition here in the U.S. to tip for service. And that has undermined any other industry as well when it comes to tipping, because, well, if you don't tip an Uber, why tip anywhere else? So that's also hurt the service industry across the board. But my purpose in being here today is, we have been successful as the Alliance for Independent Workers to advocate on behalf of not just drivers, but gig workers across the board. We're talking about workers' rights. We're talking about corporations putting profits before people. And we cannot allow that to happen. It's unsustainable. As you see, it's a Ponzi scheme, it's a pyramid scheme, it's a house of cards waiting to tumble. So I don't pit driver against driver here. I look at us all as workers' rights, that we're entitled to human rights as well. For sustainability, and what we're looking at here in our specific area in San Francisco is basically the impact upon society as a whole. You have a greater carbon footprint. Yes, Uber and Lyft say that they're helping the system here by providing infrastructure support where it's lacking. And unfortunately, in areas where taxi drivers were lacking, outer Sunset, outer Richmond, We had plenty of riders that were always stating, hey, thanks for coming out, because, taxi drivers would be called and then they would just cancel and not let us know, and then we'd have to call another cab and another 45 minutes would pass and so on and so forth. So there was obviously a need to be filled. Now, Uber and Lyft doing it the way they've done it, putting corporate profits before people, is not acceptable. So they've basically exploited that and practiced extreme capitalism, which you see the results. You see folks driving in from all parts of the state, living in their cars 3-4 nights in a row, leaving their families. Driver's exhaustion, by the way, is worse than driving drunk. So do I agree about regulation? Yes, I do. Fingerprinting should be done. We should be held to certain standards on par with professionalism, and that is exactly why the Walmartization of rideshare has occurred, and Uber has led the charge there, and followed by Lyft. We cannot leave Lyft out of the mix here. I don't know why everyone refers to Uber, and it is the Uberization of the world. I agree. But Lyft is, like I was quoted in SF Weekly, Lyft is the mini-me to the Dr. Evil Uber, okay? So they are both in the same bed together. And it is, once again, practicing corporate profits before people, which is impacting, society as a whole. You have a greater carbon footprint, but also I mentioned a driver's exhaustion, public safety. It's not just the driver, it's not just the rider, but it's the person crossing the street. It's the person riding the bike. So it's the person in the other car. So everyone should be concerned about what's going on here. Misclassification of employment is happening. We currently have a complaint filed with the National Labor Relations Board, and we're supported by SEIU National Attorney on this matter, and is basically misclassification of employment. Myself, I've been deactivated from the app for having advocated on behalf of other drivers rather. And I have been effective in getting people reactivated, which is quite a chore for most folks, but by using the support of organized labor, I've been most effective in doing so. But the bottom line is there's a host of many negative effects that are being laid upon society as a whole. It's not just here, it's going global. And so we really need to address all these matters up front. One of them is misclassification of employment. It's really taking away from what it means legally to be an independent contractor. And so that's way bigger than a driver's issue. This is crossing all areas. And realize I started off by saying about the gig economy. You're talking about 1/3 of the workforce, and that's growing. The on-demand portion right now is approximately close to 4 million. In 4 years, they're projected to be beyond 9 million workers in the on-demand portion alone of the gig economy. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about corporations not assuming their full responsibility for society. So they're pushing that onto the gig economy. So therefore, you've got the gig economy workers, as Uber had in a commercial for some time. I think they've pulled that commercial. But Uber was running a commercial saying, get your side hustle on. So I don't know about you folks, but when I was younger, the hustle is not really a good thing. If it's on the side, it's even worse, because it implies that it's kind of shady, if not worse. So we have to take a look at all these different components, because these corporations will love us workers to just divide and conquer, be divided amongst ourselves and be easily conquered. And we cannot allow that to happen by giving our power away. So we need to unite on common grounds and really look at the factors of sustainability. Do they exist, yes or no? And let's focus on areas that we have in common so that we could look to improve those. Thank you.
Arias from the Tech Workers Coalition was going to say a few words. I don't know. No? Okay.
Well, I just want to say that a lot of people from the Tech Workers Coalition that are tech workers are the major users of our service, because they are the early adopters of technology. However, that being said, we've been working jointly, and we actually extended the invitation to Aries and the Tech Workers Coalition. As you know, they've been working with Unite Here and are very supportive in workers' rights. So, you know, together we can. Si se puede. Yes, we can.
Okay.
So thanks for being here, Aries.
Thank you.
Stop. And then the regulatory bodies, the CPUC, came in afterwards and basically legalized it because of the embarrassment, I think, that they were just simply being ignored. In every case, their actions have been gone to committee, have passed unanimously in committees in Sacramento, in Assembly committees and in Senate committees, and have passed unanimously, almost unanimously, in the Assembly and the Senate, and have been signed by the governor. So that is a massive amount of capital, it seems to me, required to pay off, and I can't imagine it happening naturally, to pay off all these people to get the kind of legislation they want, especially these pool things, which were operating already for 6 months before there was finally a decision on them.
Two things out there that I wanted to respond to. In order to increase the number of taxi cabs on San Francisco streets, we need to go through an environmental impact report, or we're not allowed to do it. There's no environmental impact report required for creating a new industry, or supposedly new industry, the TNCs. They should have to, there should be some kind of environmental requirement. And the other thing is, in terms of the data, about 5 years ago, the MTA forced all the taxi cabs to go to an electronic system where they would automatically be transmitting their data to the MTA. They call it e-way bills. So that's happening now. The city has all of the taxis data, and the San Francisco County Transportation Authority, which is basically the Board of Supervisors wearing a different hat, is now suing to get a hold of all of Uber's data. Uber and the TNC data. And so that's what I see. I mean, you're right. We absolutely have to have the data, and it is, you know,
Can I say something?
it's not right. There is too much at stake not to have that access to that data.
Yeah, I think the data in terms of kind of like environmental impact or like impact on the infrastructure of the city is one side of things. I think maybe your question was more specific in terms of like users' data and, or just, well, I guess like,
That are available for use potentially for organizing work.
Well, they claim it's proprietary, and so a judge has affirmed their ability to get away with that, which is unacceptable.
I guess I just wanted to say there's kind of a regulatory pathway to take, and there's also like having organization, like worker organization, you know, like the whole classic idea of like workers owning the means of production, and that's like a possibility in the tech industry as well. I think because there's not really any like, as a tech worker, I have no protection. Like if I want to take a stand about automation of like something on the production side, if I, you know, right now I might not feel good about working on that, but like what can I do? I'll just get fired if I try to take a stand on it. And I have no, you know, I'm an at-will employee. I have no protections at my job. And the same thing goes for workers at like a company like Palantir that controls like a ton of data, a lot of surveillance data. They're building infrastructure for the police state, basically. There's workers there that I'm sure disagree with that, but you know, what can they do? And so I think there's opportunities there that we have to look beyond what our politicians, you know, how we get sold out continuously by the Democrats or whoever, whatever other politicians out there. So we need to, I think, continue to build worker power as opposed to just, you know, sponsoring
I'd
Democrats.
like to just say another thing. Unfortunately, we do live in a state, and the state makes the laws. And the laws have been changed already by the lawmakers in a completely corrupt manner. The question is, what do we do now? Is basically, how do we change the laws back or change the laws to something different? They have billions of dollars. We have manpower, people power. I suggest that we have to organize like they did in the past, like they did in the 1890s, they did in the 1920s, 1930s. We have to organize, we have to bring whatever social pressure we can back to producing a climate in this country where, it's not capital first, but it's labor first.
Policy just strictly about legislation and promoting that, but you have to hit it like shotgun approach. You have to have your actions. You have to be pushing the narrative out to the media that there are these violations of our communities across the country. So it's not just a one-trick pony. Because as I mentioned earlier, politicians are not going to do their job unless we make them. And if we use the press, and by having actions out in the streets, and we get the support of the communities, not just the riders, not just the drivers, but the community at large, then we can make a difference.